Good morning, and welcome to Lopes on Movies. For this week's episode, I had the great pleasure of interviewing my friend Daniel Scarpati, a filmmaker based in New York City. Dan recently released a book titled Gofers on the front lines of film and television, which explores his time working as a production assistant on various film and TV productions across the country. After I read the book a few weeks ago, I knew I had to get Dan on the show to talk about it. He has so many interesting stories to tell, and if you're curious about some of the finer details of how movies and TV are made, I think this is a really great place to start. Hey Dan, thank you so much for joining me. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, Joey. Thank you for having me. It's an honor and a privilege.
Yeah, I'm super happy to get you on the show. I mean, it's actually we talked, maybe about like a week ago or so, just kind of setting up for the show, but it had been quite a long time because so we first met actually at a film festival where we both had
That's right.
films in being screened there. I think it was in New Jersey. And yeah, it's something I don't talk about often on the show. That at one point I was really into trying to make movies, and I kind of did some independent filmmaking on my own here at school. And the one film festival we got this movie we made, So What, into was at this place in this bar in New Jersey, and it was there that we met because you had a film playing there, Klaus.
That's right. I think it was. I think, if I remember correctly, it was the Brightside Tavern Shorts Film
Yeah,
Festival.
that's what it was called. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was in Jersey.
So I just want to get a little bit of some background on your sort of interest in movies, going from that to an interest in working in the industry. So the one of the main reasons that I'm talking to you today is that you wrote a book about your time as a production assistant on movies. And a production assistant, like you kind of describe it as the jobs that nobody else wants to do, but that need to get done on a movie set goes to all the production assistants, and that's a very wide amount of jobs. But it's very much an entry level job. It's something that the pay is not necessarily very great. There's no benefits. The hours are grueling, and there's just a large variety of different responsibilities that are going to be on a production assistant. But the logic is that if you work as a production assistant for long enough, you build a vast network of contacts in the film and television industry. You work on getting a list of credits together that can help you apply for union membership down the
Yep.
line,
Yep.
and a lot of other kind of things going into it. So the trade off is like it's not very glamorous work, but the hope is that in the future it'll do something for you. So let me just starting with that. So you mentioned in your book sort of your initial thoughts on film, and I feel like it takes a very particular person to stick with the passion for movies to actually decide I'm going to be a production assistant. I'm going to do all this work. I'm going to pay my dues. So what was it about like movies that really drew you to wanting to just enter that world at kind of like whatever it took?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of things in the book. Which, by the way, that in case people get confused, the title is, well, the full title is Gophers on the front lines of film and television, but the
Yes.
shorthand of it, the Gophers. That is a term that, if you look it up in the dictionary, I think it's the Oxford Dictionary is the one that actually aligns it with the film set. Usually a low level
Hmm.
person who works on a film set to go for things. I first
Hmm.
heard it at the Disney World Indiana Jones Epic Stunt Spectacular. I remember I was
Sure.
sitting there and they said, I'm a gopher because I go for things. I never got called a gopher. I got called a PA.
Hmm.
Well, I did get called a gopher, but that was a little later on. At the time, I hadn't heard gopher that way. And then later I did. I
Hmm.
said, oh, now it makes sense. But it is one word for production assistant.
Hmm.
Um, there were movies I saw as a kid, just like I'm sure you have your movies. I think everybody who works in the industry in some capacity had something they watched when they were younger. For me, it was Jurassic Park.
Hmm.
For you, it's probably going to be a different movie, or maybe for someone it would be a TV show,
Hmm.
or it could be a news piece. Some people who want to do like ABC News. But the whole movie making business, I vividly remember, and I wrote about this kind of early on in the book, that my first glance at the movie making process was when Spike Lee was in my neighborhood making this movie She Hate Me.
Hmm.
Um, And I was so young at the time. I didn't know who Spike Lee was. I heard everyone saying his name, and everybody was really excited. So I gathered that he was a celebrity. But it was seeing literally right outside my window all these trailers lined up, all the
Mhm.
people. I mean, so many people. It looked like hundreds of people who were a part of the crew, the cameras, the lights, and I was very from a young age. I thought that was really cool, and it was interesting
Mhm.
that those people were working professionally in that capacity. And then as I grew up, I said and found out, oh, that's a real career that many people go.
Mhm.
Um, those were all the formative things that I suppose led me to be very interested in behind the scenes work.
I guess like after that, so you're interested in the kind of the behind the scenes work, and then as you get older, it's like okay, that I need to kind of get a path for this. So you decided to go to college and study some of this, correct?
Yeah, I've been making movies. Another element of my life, which I didn't write about in the book. I kind of struggled with it for a while, but it's still something that one day I figured this is more for the memoir. If the life is a success, and that all of a sudden there's a bunch of people who care about my own personal life story, movie making, we're not there yet. Maybe we'll all be there one day. Who knows? But
Mhm.
there's an element of my life where I was severely bullied in elementary school around the time where YouTube was just coming about.
Mhm.
And I had friends who made a little video on there and said, "Oh, you could make videos and share them with people, and there's a little audience, people could watch them."
Mhm.
And I guess I had a neighbor who I had no friends at school, but I had this neighbor who had moved in while I had no friend at school situation, and he had a camera, and we just started making movies together in his backyard. Um, he's since moved away, but we made videos, we put them up on YouTube, and
Mhm.
I'd been doing that for a while. But you're right. When I after a while I said, okay, there's a lot I've learned from YouTube, and I loved making videos and showing them to my family, and I did theater in middle school.
Mhm.
And I'm sure you and a lot of other people can relate to this kind of story. It's just like you're growing. You're all of a sudden you're doing more and more creative things, and you want to keep going. So I
Mhm.
said, college, any college really that has any kind of a film or TV department, I considered to learn more about the trade and what it actually takes to make a professional, I suppose
Sure.
we could say, a motion picture, like something on
Right.
the
Yeah.
Warner Brothers scale.
So you go through college. You make a bunch of student films, I assume. Klaus being one of them.
Right.
You screen them in a few things, and then you graduate, and it's like, okay, what next? And as we've kind of talked about in the intro, it's you decide to go into this production assistant world. So where did you first kind of hear about this entry level position in filmmaking that so many people go into?
Well, I think I first heard about it. Uh, Predominantly, it was in college. When I went to college, it was a few professors who were saying, I went in saying, how do you go to become a movie director
Hmm.
in high school, and when I was performing in theater.
Hmm.
I understood the backstory of someone like Steven Spielberg and how you can start out making movies and people get noticed, and then one day, all of a sudden, somebody gets offered a big project. And that's kind of how it goes. And, that's still a way that exists. It's certainly not the case that you can't just make a great movie and the right person sees it and all of a sudden you're
Hmm.
hired to be a director. It's
Hmm.
happened to a lot of people. It still does.
Sure.
um but on the other side of things, the other hand, I didn't really know what the if there's any kind of what I guess it's like this. All those people that I saw when I was a kid, I knew that they all couldn't have done that. There must be some kind of path. And in
Sure.
college they told me, the professors, that production assistants is kind of the widest entry level job that most people will start out as, no matter
Hmm.
what they'd like to be. Editor, sound mixer, assistant director, director. Production assistant is that entry level point that you've done a good
Hmm.
job of explaining.
The thing that I found so fascinating about the book when I was reading through it is that I kind of like secondhand felt the exhaustion that you must have felt working the job as a production assistant. I mean, like, so we're talking grueling 12-hour days, general lack of respect from your bosses a lot of the time. You're constantly hustling to find new jobs because nothing in the film and television industry is a 9 to 5. You have this job. It's pretty much you're working for the duration of the shoot, and then you're looking for
Yeah,
work. You never
yeah.
really have a moment to yourself because you're working 12-hour days. You have to navigate some really kind of arcane union rules on set. Um, so
It's a very good
I,
way of putting it.
yeah.
Arcane union rule.
Yeah. I mean, it was fascinating, like reading it, because this is one of the first times I've really like seen all of it laid out in such a concise manner. Because obviously I've heard stories from people here and there, but this was the
Sure.
first time I was like, wow, this is this this must be crazy. But like the question that I want to ask you, as having been through it, so why do this job? You know, like what is the light at the end of the tunnel for someone who decides like, yeah, I'm gonna pay my dues and work this incredibly demanding job, and in
Yeah.
hopes that it'll lead to something in the future.
That is the question. That is the big question that everybody asks, and you are not wrong to ask it. I didn't know when I started, and I should say that this is where a lot of the point of the book was, as I started PAing and did all these things you're saying and worked these crazy days. Yes, the minimum was 12 hours in pretty much all productions I was a part of, and I started on very tiny non-union things and then slowly worked my way up. Non-union being, I guess, independent, for those who might not be
Mhm.
familiar with. Usually independent projects are the ones that people aren't in unions, but once you reach a certain tier of like primetime shows, like on Kevin Can Wait and Murphy Brown, where I was a key set
Mhm.
PA, or feature films. I worked as an additional PA on something like Paterno for HBO or
Mhm.
Wonderstruck. Once you get to that kind of studio level where you're working with union actors, everybody's kind of union. Everybody is union,
Mhm.
except for the PAs. That's the last
Sure.
position. It's the point at which everybody says, okay, we have to have somebody who can fill the gaps between everybody else and do all those jobs that nobody necessarily wants to do, bringing the waters into the cast and crew and running them to the talent and the director. Um, so it was really tricky to navigate, and I kind of had to learn trial by fire. But you meet other
Mhm.
PAs who are like you, and they too want things. Some of them want to be assistant directors, some of them want to act, many of them want to direct.
Mhm.
I found, at least, there were many of my friends who had ideas that they were writing screenplays while they were, in their off hours. And the light at
Sure.
the end of the
Yeah.
tunnel for a lot of people was, oh, I'm going to meet the right person, or the right person is going to notice me, or I'm going to be in the
Mhm.
right place at the right time, and
Mhm.
get some kind of offer that's going to allow me to, take the next steps in my career. It
Mhm.
is, it sounds like a gamble, and you say it can't be that much of a gamble. And it's sort of true. I mean, the industry is small, and it's like so many people say, at least here in New York, which is the bulk of where my work was done, although I've done
Mhm.
work kind of across the country. In Mississippi, I worked on some documentary productions and
Mhm.
automotive videography, and then New Jersey and Connecticut. But uh, everybody sort of knows everybody. So as you're going along, you're meeting a lot of people and you're learning their names, and then you very
Mhm.
quickly develop a reputation as a
Mhm.
great PA. You hope, and then you keep getting hired. And soon enough, if you say, "Okay, what I really want to do is assistant direct," all those people who know you as a PA will eventually say, "Okay, if you get if you're on the union level and you do your time and you put your book in, which is your collection of days that prove that you've done the work, okay,
Mhm.
yeah, you know what? We've seen you work as a PA. We bet you do great as an AD. So we'll hire you for an
Mhm.
AD." I hope
Sure.
that it's kind of a long way to go about it, but it's sort of like an educated light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah. So like, I guess the next question would be, so if you're talking to somebody who's like, oh, I really love, like, I love Christopher Nolan or something, I want to make movies like that, would you tell them, okay, you should be a PA to do this? Like, what do you tell somebody who's interested in working at that kind of level of filmmaking, especially like a young person who's like, really excited and kind of inspired by those kinds of movies?
Well, Joey, if I'm being honest, I wouldn't necessarily say go be a PA.
Hmm.
I found that that was the path for me because I was very curious to learn how those types of movies, those Nolan movies, were made on a
Hmm.
professional scale. I didn't quite have the confidence I have now in terms of going out and be able to be feeling like I was able to make my own movie. I I felt like I had to build that up, and by working as a
Hmm.
PA, I learned many interpersonal skills that I think are universally
Hmm.
translatable. I just read Dale Carnegie's book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. I think we talked about it in our call the other week, and I was just so
Hmm.
blown away that it's universally translatable life lessons. Same happens when you're working on a film set. You're talking with people, even during the pandemic. Now there's still a lot of interaction going on. But take
Hmm.
for example, that's somebody who wants to be like Nolan. Nolan, one of his earlier films, if I'm remembering correctly, I forget the name of it, but it was the one where He made that early film where there was a bug man, or his man, a man who was trying to kill this insect, this bug, and it was a
Hmm.
10-minute short film. And I think, I don't want to give it away in case you haven't seen it. It's available to watch on YouTube, you meeting
Hmm.
the listeners. But it's 10 minutes short. He made it. Great little twist at the end. Fun story. Again, I hope this is Nolan I'm remembering, but he went on to, I think, win a festival or two with it or share it with people.
Hmm.
And he just kept going from there. And
Sure.
eventually he reached a point where people saw his films and understood the quality of what he wanted to do. And he had ideas, and he made that path of becoming his own filmmaker work. So you can
Yeah.
go that way if you have the confidence and the creative ideas. Um,
Hmm.
or if you're looking for what I was, where you don't necessarily have the confidence. You have ideas, but you're just so lost, and you say, "What is it really like to make a movie?" Being a PA is a great way to learn behind the scenes of how it works.
Yeah, I think it's there's so many different paths you can take, and it's something that you really have to figure out for yourself, and commit to it. I think is the big thing, and because it's not nothing that you do in trying to get into movies is something you can do lightly, which I think everybody that attempts it figures out pretty early on.
Yeah, 100%. Commitment's an important word, and paths is the other important word that you know
Hmm.
from seeing the book. But I had a little chapter dedicated to it, and it's all that's a question I always heard. Where again, I having worked as a PA for about 6 years, 6 years before I took the next steps, and I started working as camera operator, and now I
Hmm.
work through my own little company. I do local videography, and I still
Hmm.
consider myself a young fledgling filmmaker. I'd love to get back
Hmm.
to making ones like the ones we made and showed in Jersey.
Of course,
And
yeah.
I can't wait to do that. I still feel like I'm working toward it. So my career
Hmm.
is young in that sense as well. Um, but it's important to remember that there is no one path to go. You can start in one place and end up in such an incredibly different place. So far, the great
Hmm.
example. There was an actress I worked with, a stunt performer, who started out as a driver, driving someone a set. She happened to be the right fit for I remember it was like a monster uniform that they needed someone
Hmm.
last minute on this non-union independent project. She fit the costume, and they said, "Get over here, we're putting you in this costume." All of a sudden, she's fighting as a monster. Then she goes on to take stunt courses. Now she joins SAG-AFTRA as a stunt performer. Now she's working on the biggest thing. You never know. That's the
Yeah.
funny thing about this industry. It attracts people because of that, because it's like the lottery. You don't quite know what's going to happen until you play
Hmm.
it. So I
Right.
think
Yeah.
it's important to remember there's tons of different outcomes that could happen from the actions that you take.
So here's just kind of one question I wanted to get into, because one thing I really appreciated about your book is that it's very frank about some of the challenges of working as a production assistant. Like you mentioned the sleep deprivation, then you tell an anecdote about a time where you had worked on an insanely long day and had to drive home after that, and it was incredibly dangerous. But
Yeah,
it's not an
I almost
uncommon
died.
story for
I
people. Yeah,
almost
like
died, and I don't
yeah.
I don't say it to be overly dramatic. I recognized as soon as I laid down in bed that night, I almost died because I was
Hmm.
working as a PA, because I felt like I had to prove something.
Hmm.
And I almost paid my life for it. And that still kind of scares me a little bit. That was a day that kind
Hmm.
of woke me up to, don't kill yourself. We're not
Yeah, right.
curing cancer necessarily by making a movie. There are
Hmm.
limits here.
Yeah, and I think it's fascinating because after that you had mentioned, like, talking to other people and talking all of them about, like, their, like, bragging about all the hours that they've worked, and but everybody is sleep deprived. You mentioned, like, everybody in that is
Yeah.
working as a PA especially is not, it's not a healthy lifestyle, and it just makes me wonder, like, man, how is that possible? How can they get away with working people this hard?
I know it's very situational. I'll say, my experiences don't necessarily, indicate this is the way that every PA lives
Mhm.
their lives, but I can tell you that everyone that I worked with, was sleep deprived. There were
Yeah,
people
right.
who, I mean, struggling for sleep is an issue because you're working every day, and people do it because they 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 believe it's going to lead them somewhere, and in many cases it will. They're proving themselves, and their bosses are working as hard or even harder or even longer hours. Some of the assistant directors that I
Sure.
worked with, who are great, did even more, and the PAs, myself included. That's one of the reasons I worked that long day and almost got myself killed. I said, I haven't worked as much as that other person who I know has been, that AD who I admire has been working longer. So I pushed myself
Mhm.
to be like them. but I
Hmm.
realized that not everybody, is the same in terms of physical ability. Some people,
Hmm.
I need a little more sleep than maybe many of those people do. I guess I'm not ashamed to say, and I
Sure.
learned that the hard way. So it's very situational, and there's reasons why people want to do it. And I think that Roy Wagner, who's a cinematographer, I quote him in the book, and I really like the way that he said it. Hollywood only wants you to have one mistress, and that's her. And people,
Hmm.
in the documentary where he said that people will do anything. People will do anything sometimes to get that. People will do anything to prove themselves, and they'll work whatever, they'll do whatever. They don't care. And there's enough people out there like that that I don't think there's no PA union for that reason. There's plenty of people who don't care for there to be rules because they say I'm going to get ahead by pushing myself to the extreme.
Hmm.
And not that that's a bad thing, but that's kind of the way I look at it.
There was an interesting story you told, I think, about kind of a conversation you had with a sound person, where you
Uh-huh.
got the impression that this person had, like, at one point wanted to, like, be a director or wanted to do
Oh
something, but
yeah,
then
yeah, yeah.
they kind of have become complacent and almost jaded by having done the job for so long and kind of specialize. They go into a specialized field and just kind of stay there, and that kind of magic of wanting to be somebody who's telling stories, wanting to be like an actual filmmaker, kind of wore off a little bit. Do you think that that's like, is that like the most common thing to happen, or is that just a potential
Hmm.
risk that you have to kind of mitigate?
I wouldn't say it's the most common thing to happen, but I will tell you, I saw that time and time again, where at least what the people were presenting to me was it the way they truly felt. I believe so. It's
Hmm.
possible there were enough people fooling me and trying to make me feel discouraged enough where they would thin out the competition and say, all right, good,
Sure.
I got another person out of here, so now I'm that much closer to directing the show. Ha ha.
Yeah,
It's
right.
possible, sure, but there were too many people on too many occasions that told me stories that made me feel pretty upset about my peers. And I said, wow, I mean that's a person who really wanted to try to do something, and they're not unhappy
Hmm.
with where they are, but they acknowledge that it's not at all where they wanted to be or want to
Sure.
be, but they keep doing it.
Is that kind of like, I guess it's a sum total of a lot of things, but is that sort of where your head was at when you decided to kind of stop doing PA work?
Pretty much. It was a sum total, but yeah, I recognized that if I kept on going like I was, I saw myself becoming an AD, and I saw by going through the days that qualified and joining the
Hmm.
guild, and I saw myself keeping down that path and spending years doing that, like many other ADs do. And
Hmm.
I recognized that that's a great path, and if you want to do that, you should totally do it. I think that there's a lot of good reasons to do it, but it wasn't the path I originally set out to go down. And I
Hmm.
said, let me pause and reassess and go down a path I think I'd enjoy a little bit more. So that's
Sure.
that's that's a big reason for me.
Are there any stories from the book that you're particularly fond of?
You hit on kind of a few of them. The driving one always gets me because that driving and falling asleep. I think that's one of the most important things that people need to know, not to
Yeah, I
physically
think
push
that's
themselves.
that's a big time cautionary tale.
Yeah, that I mean, and that's what, like I said, since it was literally, I can't exaggerate it. It was a near death experience for me. It sticks with me the most. But beyond that, there was another physical story of, again, keeping it very short. But I ended up getting a polynidal cyst on my buttocks because I was jumping in and out of cars, and again, not caring about my physical health. And I ended
Hmm.
up giving myself a cyst that needed to be surgically removed. And yeah, I would say that the most important lessons really have to do with physical health and taking care of yourself.
One story I really thought was interesting was, you mentioned a very brief interaction you had with Steve Buscemi,
Yes.
where you had kind of, you didn't really have much time to talk to him, but you wanted to just like say, oh, I really liked your work, and I think you mentioned Monsters Inc. or something
I
like that.
did. I did.
Um,
I did. I can't
and
believe I did.
well, it's interesting because, right, like, after you had stopped being a PA and you found yourself with having a lot more time, you started checking out a lot of the independent work that Steve Buscemi had done, like, prior to him being in, doing like big movies, big like animated movies and stuff. And like, this was
Right.
like, really down to earth, like New York filmmaking. Like, this is probably the stuff that a guy like Buscemi is really passionate about. And you kind of lament, so it's like, oh man, I wish I had had time to like know a little bit more about about the culture and everything, so that when I actually talked to Steve Buscemi, I wasn't bringing up, Monsters Inc. I was bringing up
And
something
Mr.
that,
Deeds. Mr.
yeah,
Deeds and
Mr.
Monsters
Deeds, right,
Inc.
right, yeah, like I was
Old
bringing up
crazy
something,
eyes.
So I thought that was really interesting because again, like it's a trade off. If you're super passionate about movies and you want to, just you decide to be a PA, that's great. But like, are you gonna have any time to watch movies? Probably not.
That was the running joke that, at least on TV shows, I remember people would always say we're so busy making television that we don't have time to watch it. And that
Hmm.
everybody said that, costumers, sound mixer, everybody. It was always like, oh yeah, they'd hear it and kind of shrug it off and walk away. But you're right, the Steve Buscemi job, or rather the time I worked with him, and I learned, I also thought his name was pronounced Buscemi, but apparently he pronounces it Buscemi. I learned that when I
That's
worked with
fascinating.
him. Yeah, it's funny. It's like everybody, culture has put the Shemi on him, but it's really
Yeah.
Semi. So I learned,
Wow.
but I felt that was a wake up call moment for me, and that is something that I'm glad you bring it up. I would remind people to keep that long term goal in mind and say,
Hmm.
what is it that you really want to do? Because I got so focused on being the best PA, that in the moment I recognized how influential Steve had been in my young filmmaking life, seeing him act and seeing the roles that he brought to life. I recognized that, but I realized I couldn't even have a conversation with him because I didn't have any kind of, I wasn't thinking like a director,
Hmm.
really even professionally. I was thinking like a fan. And it
Hmm.
occurred to me that I shouldn't be acting that way. And if that's all PAing was going to bring me to, that wasn't the path I wanted to be on. And yeah, those
Sure.
movies that he did, if I had only watched In the Soup, if I had only watched Living in Oblivion, oh my gosh, I still kick myself knowing I was in the elevator with him every day on this job. I could have just, somehow mentioned it and said, "Oh yeah, I was thinking about doing a movie this way." Just the difference in conversation I would have had as an
Hmm.
equal-minded filmmaker, and storyteller, rather than a fan who was kind of gawking and saying, "Oh, you're just great. Thank you for being great." It would have been very, very different.
Sure. Yeah, but I mean, those are the kinds of like stories that are in your book that I think are really valuable, especially to anybody who's like, who's interested in following along a similar path. I think it's very instructive. So, where can people find your book if they're interested in reading it?
The easiest place to go is www.passingplanes.com/book. I have the link and the trailer, and you can buy it online at many stores. And it's also available if you're in New York at a little bookstore called Book Culture up in Long Island City. So feel free to take a peek.
Yeah, super nice. If you happen to find yourself up in Long Island City, that'll be the place to be, I guess.
It was the one bookstore that would have me. The rest kicked me on the street. So there you go.
Hey, that's
Get out of
I
here, kid.
appreciate. I appreciate the hustle though. Like you went to different bookstores and you're like, "Hey, I got a book. Will you hold it?" But that's what you got to do if you want to be a filmmaker, man. You got to put yourself out there.
I appreciate you recognizing that. It was something that I learned it the hard way. And, it does speak, like I said, I like to think everything can, and you clearly do too. And I admire that about you. You can apply many things to the filmmaker's life or to the artist's life, I suppose, on a broader term. But yeah, it was an honor being a PA. I look back on those days fondly, and I do believe there's enough in there in the book to entertain and educate, depending on which side you want to be on. And I tried my best, but feel free to leave a negative review, and I'll learn, and grow and get better for the next book. That's how it works.
Well, thank you so much, Dan, for joining me. This was a really interesting conversation. And again, like I hope everybody listening considers checking out the book because I think it'll give you an interesting perspective on the film industry, film and television industry that you just might not have ever considered. And I think it's worth having in mind. It might change your perspective on some of the stuff you're watching here and there.
Thank you for saying that, Joey. I think just the fact that you and I have stayed in touch and met as filmmakers, as young filmmakers at a little festival in New Jersey, and have stayed in touch, and now you're running a podcast, and here you've kindly invited me to talk about my career. The fact that this has happened proves that this creative path really could be for you, and you don't have to know anyone. You don't have to have any kind of special training. You can make it happen on your own, and
That
I'm
you
happy to
can.
be here with you, man.